What's up, Wisecrack? Jared again. So, Game of Thrones is over. If you're one of those people who smugly reminds every person you know that you don't watch Game of Thrones, you might have missed the part where 1.5 million people signed a petition to get Season 8 remade with, quote, competent writers. People hate this finale. And yeah, fans complained about The Office when Michael Scott left, or how Dexter concluded, or the whole Sopranos thing, but the rage against Game of Thrones seems to transcend all barriers. It has truly united the fractured American public. After 73 plus hours of prophecy, statecraft, death, magic, more death, and zombies, we were given an ending that felt rushed, poorly executed, and possibly dumb. But unlike Twitter, we want to give the show its fair shot. After all, we even tried to see the light in things like this.
I don't like sand.
Or this.
Not the beast!
Endings, by their very nature, solidify the themes of the show and color the meaning of every episode that came before it. So now that we have an ending to this milestone in television, it's time to ask, what is Game of Thrones about? And is it deep or dumb? Welcome to this Wisecrack edition on the Game of Thrones finale. Deep or dumb, and obviously spoilers ahead. But before we get to it, I want to give a shout out to our sponsors over at Skillshare, the online learning community. We're all about lifelong learning here at Wisecrack, so having over 25,000 classes at our fingertips has been really rewarding. There are so many different courses to choose from. One I found particularly useful was the Writer's Toolkit, 6 Steps to Successful Writing Habit. Something it focused on that I took to heart was the medium. I get way too distracted when I'm working through early drafts on a computer, so I switched to a notepad and now I'm way more productive. That applies to all kinds of writing, but there are even courses specifically about making internet content. Whether you want to do what we do and make video essays or create blogs, Skillshare can guide you on your journey to build an audience. So get 2 months for free by clicking the link in the description. And now, back to the show. First, an insanely basic overview of the show is in order. Game of Thrones is about the literal game for the throne. In the wake of the king's death, the Seven Kingdoms are thrown into chaos as competing factions duke it out for supremacy. Also, a woman gets dragons. She burns all her enemies and finally wins that game, but it turns out the real reward wasn't the friends she made along the way. She gets replaced by the NSA, Bran, who can spy on you at any time with his magic. The end. To figure out whether this ending had some greater message or maybe was just awful, we'll be looking at 2 critical elements of the show: its political world building and its relationship to the fantasy genre. Part 1, Breaking the Wheel? Now that we loosely understand what happens in the show, we have to figure out, what is it trying to say? One big indicator that the events of the show have translated into meaningful change for the realm is the big, expensive visual metaphor in which the dragon melts the Iron Throne. Certainly, the wheel has been broken then, right? Well, let's find out. Throughout the show, we see the way common people suffer amongst the drama of the well-to-do lords and ladies of the land. Perhaps no character focuses on this travesty more than Daenerys Targaryen, mother of dragons, breaker of chains, and by the end, homicidal maniac. Dany has been saying for years that she means to break the wheel of the great houses of the Seven Kingdoms.
Lannister, Targaryen, Baratheon, Stark, Tyrell. They're all just spokes on a wheel. This one's on top, then that one's on top, and on it spins, crushing those on the ground.
It's a beautiful dream. Stopping the wheel. You're not the first person who's ever dreamt it.
I'm not going to stop the wheel. I'm going to break the wheel.
Dany's an interesting character because, while she often had the best intentions, her plans often have terrible consequences. In Season 4, she crucified over 100 masters in Slaver's Bay as justice for their crucifixion of slave children. Later in the season, she learns that some of those crucified masters fought to prevent the deaths of those slave children.
Your father crucified innocent children.
My father spoke out against crucifying those children.
After she liberated Astapor, it was overtaken by a new tyrant because she hadn't actually taken the time to solidify a new political system before moving on to the next city to conquer.
The council you installed to rule over the city has been overthrown by a butcher named Cleon, who's declared himself his imperial majesty.
But even as she gives speeches on mercy and liberation, Daenerys also believes that she was born to be the Queen of the Seven Kingdoms and deserves that title based on bloodline. Bloodline succession is one of the most common justifications for the wheel-turning wars that Dany claims to want to end, whether that's the War of the Five Kings or the Blackfire Rebellion. Shout out to you, book fans.
You the real MVP.
And worse, by the second to last episode, Daenerys commits some light crimes against humanity and burns King's Landing to the ground. So what is the show trying to say? If we were to zoom in on Daenerys, we might get a message like, some idealism often fails because the world is a hot garbage fire. And in the final seasons, we might see her growing frustrations with the difficulty of ruling, dramatized to show us how an idealist turns into a war criminal. Instead, she just takes a hard right turn and her insanity is justified through some heavy-handed foreshadowing.
Let it be fair.
Is it because through these shows' careful plotting of politics, viewing yourself as the savior of the world is a recipe for tyranny? Maybe that's what the show was going for, but with just a crammed-in speech Tyrion made post-facto to draw this connection, it seems light.
Everywhere she goes, evil men die, and we cheer her for it. And she grows more powerful and more sure that she is good and right. She believes her destiny is to build a better world for everyone. If you believed that, if you truly believed it, wouldn't you kill whoever stood between you and paradise?
That's the best case. The worst case seems to be that madness is genetic, as this clip indicates.
They say every time a Targaryen is born, the gods toss a coin and the world holds its breath.
Whatever they were trying to say, Daenerys did not end up the savior nor the oppressor of the realm. She got shanked. So, if she didn't break the wheel, did someone else? Is the wheel still intact? And what bearing does this have on the themes of politics, ruling, and leadership? If the whole point of the show is studying the difficulties of ruling, and if we expect some sort of cathartic conclusion at the end of any narrative, something must change. We should walk away with a takeaway. In one of the last scenes of the finale, we see the remaining lords and ladies of the great houses convene in a council to determine who will lead Westeros. Tyrion, still handcuffed, proposes that what the country needs is a leader with a good story, who will unite the people and
Lead us into the future.
He also proposes a nifty political system to break the wheel called oligarchy, where bloodline succession will be replaced by a dozen wealthy and powerful families deciding each new leader via their own messed up internal politics.
Sons of kings can be cruel and stupid, as you well know. His will never torment us. That is the wheel our queen wanted to break. From now on, rulers will not be born. They will be chosen. On this spot are the lords and ladies of Westeros.
Never mind that half the Great Council is made up of northern families, who then immediately secede from the country.
The North will remain an independent kingdom.
It's the equivalent of like the southern states swaying the US election right before they simultaneously peace out from the Union. So we'll see how that goes. So if we're judging whether or not the wheel has truly been broken, one approach might be to weigh the possible effects of the new oligarchy on the small folk. Ostensibly, the goal of breaking the wheel is to better the lives of the small folk, the peasants who have no noble standing. Dany wanted to free them from tyrants, Varys wanted to free them from tyrants, Sansa wanted to free the northern small folk from tyrants, and Tyrion wants to free them from tyrants who don't have a good elevator pitch. But even his own story spiel isn't terribly consistent. 2 episodes ago, he argued to Varys that most of the millions of people in Westeros don't care who sits on the Iron Throne.
You know I will never betray the realm.
What is the realm? A vast continent home to millions of people, most of whom don't care who sits on the Iron Throne.
Millions of people, many of whom will die if the wrong person sits on that throne.
Even with the throne itself melted by a grieving dragon, there's no indicator in Tyrion's final speech that he's actually changed his mind about the apathy of the people. But even if most of the realm doesn't care about Bran's story, they'll probably benefit from a pause in the wars over the throne. The Northmen aren't the only ones who have been fighting. Pretty much every great house has sent their peasants into battle at some point over the course of the show, and a new mechanism for the easy transition of power between houses would have a huge material benefit for the little guys. At the same time, the mere existence of a great council hardly guarantees they'll all agree on the next leader, or that that leader will agree to be peacefully outvoted. Both Robert's Rebellion and the War of the Five Kings are examples of what can happen when the great houses are not on the same page about who should be in power. Maybe we're all being pessimists for being skeptical that a council that convenes every couple decades might not put a stop to violent disagreement, but it might just make us realists. So it's a coin flip on whether the new oligarchy will improve the lives of the small folk, even if it's probably a safe bet that it won't make their lives any worse. Now, I'm not saying that Game of Thrones necessarily needed an optimistic ending. Maybe it was, all along, a tale about how humanity's bullshit would get them all killed, or at least living under some new despot. but it's hard to even say if the show intends this to be an optimistic or pessimistic ending. Look no further than Tyrion's first meeting as the newly instated Hand of the King. In it, Sam makes some appeals for clean water, Davos requests money to rebuild the forts and armada, Bronn insists on building more brothels, and Tyrion seems like he's trudging through the same old nonsense. So much of the show's definitive meaning is wrapped up in this scene, but it's not even clear if this is a positive step for the realm or a negative one. It really depends on how you read it. In one reading, the small council is no different than before, with a bickering bureaucracy unable to determine whether the land needs new brothels or sewers. They're just as ineffective as ever. A couple visual metaphors reinforce this reading. In one, Tyrion carefully arranges the chairs in a neat, orderly manner, as if he's trying to get it right this time. But when everyone flies in, they immediately dishevel the room. So does this mean that despite Tyrion's efforts, everything will remain the same? In a second visual cue, the camera widens out to reveal the map of Westeros fractured by a crack in the floor. Is this meant to suggest that things are still broken? The other way to read this scene is as a kind of Republican ideal, with differing perspectives coming together to do the hard work of forging new compromises for the better of the land. Not unlike America's founding fathers, who famously holed themselves up in a hot, sweaty building for months until they walked out with a constitution. So is this ambiguity in itself deep? Well, if you ask us, this isn't the kind of cool ambiguity where we ask if Cobb is still dreaming or not. That was the whole point of the film. This is like winging your high school civic speech on checks and balances and your classmates walking away with the impression that you may or may not really love Stalin. But that's just one message of the show that finds resolution. There's also the much bigger idea that the show has been dealing with for a long time, that power may inevitably corrupt those who have it. Does the finale gesture toward an end to corrupt politics, or is the new power structure still susceptible to the problems of the past? What does it mean for Bran to be king? Besides having a story, what sets Bran apart in Tyrion's speech is his three-eyed ravenness. He can warg into animals and Hodors, and he contains all the memories of humanity. As Bran reminds us when he goes to search for Drogon, he can see anything, anywhere.
Perhaps I can find him. Do carry on with the rest.
He's basically a one-man surveillance state. It sucks that Rickon died, but at least now Bran gets to be a big brother again. But is this supposed to be a good thing? Why does being the three-eyed raven make Bran a good king when it disqualified him from being Lord of Winterfell?
You know our history better than anyone.
That will be useful as Lord of Winterfell.
I'm not Lord of Winterfell. I don't really want anymore.
I envy you.
You shouldn't envy me. Mostly I live in the past.
I mean, sure, he didn't want to be king either, but he also traveled a hell of a long way to accept a position that had plenty of qualified candidates. And when Bran asks,
"Why do you think I came all this way?"
does he mean literally the journey from Winterfell to King's Landing, or more metaphorically some far-reaching plot the Three-Eyed Raven concocted years ago? Does living in the past, handing off decisions to the small council, and playing Where in the World is Drogon San Diego make him the best choice? As many frustrated fans have pointed out, the show doesn't give us a whole lot of context to understand the decision. We don't know the real significance of the Three-Eyed Raven, why he's necessary, why that position is compatible with some political titles but not others. Really, we don't know what has been going on with Bran for a couple seasons, and since the show goes all in on Bran as the answer to a decade of political strife, that's a problem. Since Bran doesn't want anymore, that's probably supposed to gesture at him being incorruptible. So if power corrupts, is it deep to say, let's give it to the omniscient wizard man who has no desires? Since to the best of my knowledge, aspiring to know everything isn't practical, I'm gonna say no. But wait, what if the show is all about how we should vest power in the people who know things? After all, the ones who really want the best for the people of Westeros are Varys, Tyrion, and Sam. People who all eventually came to fear Daenerys. What they have in common? They're interested in evidence-based decision-making, loosely speaking. If anything, Bran's ascension seems to be saying, man, if only we could have a state of technocrats, one of whom literally knows all there is to know, then everything would be fine. And that seems a little too far out of left field and more like the premise of a Black Mirror episode than the end of a fantasy series. So, is the wheel broken? Is there any meaning to the image of the throne melting? Weiss and Benioff's answer is Part 2. Fantasy? If you haven't checked out our last Game of Thrones video, I'd recommend it. While we were solidly in the wrong about who would end up on the throne, the video does a great deep dive into the show's use and subversion of various elements of the fantasy genre. Game of Thrones is famous for tossing fantasy tropes on their head. Prince Charming is a sadistic monster. The good guy protagonist loses his head in season 1, and the sweet orphaned princess ends up committing mass murder. But a few of the events in the final season have us wondering if they really are subversions or if the show retreated back to the same old stereotypes that it once rebelled against. As we mentioned in the last video, George R.R. Martin is both heavily influenced by and actively subverts the works of J.R.R. Tolkien. One Tolkien trope he directly addressed is the idea of good man equals good king. That is, if you have a pure heart, you will be a good ruler. In interviews, Martin has noted that Tolkien can say that Aragorn became king and reigned for 100 years and he was wise and good, but Tolkien doesn't ask the question, what was Aragorn's tax policy? That quote is great. It's the exact sort of interesting political nuance that we've come to expect from Game of Thrones. Which is why it's all the more frustrating that we could just change a couple words and make it, Weiss and Benioff can say that Bran became king and reigned for 100 years and that he could see things and remember things. But Weiss and Benioff don't ask the question, what was Bran's tax policy? Like we mentioned before, maybe the point is that Bran is such an absentee king that it just doesn't really matter. Maybe it's just that he puts capable people in charge. But so did Robert Baratheon. Maybe the scene where the small council meet to talk about the treasury and water supply is an answer to that question. They really are getting down to the business of ruling, and the success of the kingdom doesn't rest on Bran's character. Long live bureaucracy. But whether this is a flipped trope or just a regular trope depends a lot on how we're supposed to read Bran as king, and again, we just don't have enough context. In the same interview where he dunked on Aragorn, Martin also may have given us a hint as to why the Great War against the Night King came before the Battle for King's Landing. The war that Tolkien wrote about was a war for the fate of civilization and the future of humanity, and that's become the template. I'm not sure that it's a good template though. The Tolkien model led generations of fantasy writers to produce these endless series of dark lords and their evil minions who are all very ugly and wear black clothes. But the vast majority of wars throughout history are not like that. Evil minions? Check. Black clothes? Check. Ugly? Well, we hate to be judgy, but check. With the conflicts against the White Walkers, the show is directly referencing that genre trope, and it's not meant to be subtle. So it makes sense that they position this great war for the future of humanity before the much more realistic political war. The ultimate showdown of the series isn't over an existential threat facing humanity, it's over the fate of human politics. As far as genre subversions go, this one seems pretty clear-cut. So deep, maybe? But subversion for its own sake isn't necessarily a good thing, and this still leaves the question, why did they spend so much time building up to the battle with the Night King? Were they only using it to show that our anxieties about a centralized evil are misguided? If that's the case, why make a big show of melting the throne, or ditching the murderous Dany for the uncaring Bran? It's possible that the show is making allegorical references to the wars for humanity that have been waged in the past, one of which also heavily influenced Tolkien. World War I was far more devastating than the battle with the Night King, and perhaps coincidentally, was often referred to as the Great War. But even after it had ended, there wasn't peace and prosperity throughout the world. Certain countries were crippled or blown to bits, and the aftermath of the fighting led to an even more catastrophic war, World War II. World War II is perhaps even more convincingly described as a battle for the soul of humanity. But after it was won, we got a few decades of the Cold War, chaos in the Balkans, etc. It's possible that by making the somewhat jarring choice to move directly from the Great War to the Last War, Game of Thrones is acknowledging that wars of that magnitude leave a power vacuum and destabilize a region in a way that can lead to immediate follow-up conflicts. And so we're left with an ending that doesn't definitively point to any great peace, nor great strife. But to be honest, that doesn't really feel like what they're doing here. The Seven Kingdoms were already thoroughly destabilized even before the Great War, and as far as the show tells it, most of the southern kingdoms weren't really materially affected by the battle that they never participated in. It seems like the one big subversion the writers were going for was not making Jon the king. Instead, they sent him back north of the Wall. But choosing Bran seems less like a meaningful subversion and more like some random decision that's meant to surprise you. So again, for its treatment of the genre that we all thought it was revolutionizing, we're gonna say dumb. So what should we make of the Game of Thrones finale? We acknowledge that writing for television is a hard job, especially when expectations are this high and when you ran out of rich source material a few seasons back. Trying to complete someone else's story can't be an easy task, but honestly, we don't have a ton of sympathy for Weiss and Benioff. They had access to more money and brilliant writers than most cable or network shows could ever dream of, and they still managed to give us an ending that was both unsatisfying and confusing. There are still plenty of questions that we can ask about the finale. Does the lack of radical political change make a case for incrementalism over revolution? Does the abandonment of the show's prophecies and end to bloodline secession signal that nothing is decided by fate? So we have to ask, what was Game of Thrones trying to do? What was it all about? We probably could have answered that question better at the end of Season 1 than at the end of Season 8. D&D took a show with clear political application and interesting approach to fantasy, and made it, well, dumb. But hey, at least Jon got to pet his direwolf, and as a dog lover, that means something. Thanks to all our patrons who support the channel and our podcast. Be sure to hit that subscribe button, and before you go, I want to remind you to check out this week's sponsor, Skillshare. If you love learning and teaching like we do, Skillshare is a great place to go to hone your skills. They've even got courses that offer insight on what we do, creating essays for YouTube, blogs, or any other outlet. A lot of our videos utilize a million assets, pictures, and footage, which you can learn more about in creative video storytelling and editing, making the most of stock footage. You can also learn about optimizing the shareability of your content with going viral, write, film, and make content people share. Right now, you can get 2 months of Skillshare for free by clicking the link in the description. So check out Skillshare at the link below and start improving your skills today. And as always, thanks for watching, guys. Peace.